Okay, as we talk about delayed egress, one of the most important things you really need to understand is occupancy. Occupancy is found in Chapter 3 of the International Building Code, and occupancy helps us understand how a building is being used. You can see the code breaks a building down into its actual use, and sometimes you have to keep in mind we may have multiple uses within a building. An assembly, we think about going to a concert, going to a sporting event, going to even some type of big conferences where you go into a big conference room at a hotel or something like that. Businesses, educational facilities. Education will be broken into two different categories, as you're going to find shortly. Factories, high hazard places that deal with chemicals and maybe hazardous materials we have to be aware of. Institutional, think about going into a hospital, think about going into a medical clinic, think about even going into a daycare center. Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, even a daycare center can fall into that institutional category. You know, mercantile, going to a grocery store, going to a Target, going to a Lowe's, where we're going to go to mercantile areas, but also residential. Think about the apartment complexes, and even storage. Think about going into a storage facility where you're going to store a bunch of your belongings for an extended period of time versus something that might be maintenance or utility or for miscellaneous purposes. But also important, and you're going to find here as we continue through here, is other subcategory groups that further break down an assembly into other groups, such as movie theaters, community halls, arenas, food and drink establishments that are very big, especially get into some of the entertainment facilities. We're going to break into childcare, break down childcare a little bit more so you can figure out, is it part of an educational facility or is it part of an institutional facility? Institutional is probably the most important one we're going to work with and talk about. We have a lot of high value we put with high hazard just because of the fact of some of the chemicals that can be extremely dangerous to us. But we're also going to break into the child education and into the institutional, because those are the two primary areas where, you know, we think about people that are important to us, people that may not be able to get up and move out on their own. But we also have to be aware of, there's some places that can also add to this group. So California right now is the only state in the United States that actually has an L group, and that L group is for laboratories. So they wrote an amendment and they created a whole section just on laboratories, because they obviously have a high volume of laboratories there and it's important for them to cover it. What I'm going to do now is we're going to talk about the institutional subgrouping, because when we get into delayed egress, this is where these subgroupings become very important to us, because they are called out by the subgroupings when it comes to delayed egress. So the subgroupings, as we break them down, the first thing you can see is that, you know, what is that grouping actually include within it? In group 1, alcohol, drug, rehab. Group homes, halfway homes, residential board homes. Group 2, we're getting into something a little bit more higher care. We're getting into detox facilities, foster care, hospitals, nursing homes, psychiatric hospitals. Very high care in need of being able to take care of somebody. Group 3, this is where we're getting into more of the correctional, people who are put into a place for containment, for some type of purpose of controlling them. Group 4, well, that's a little bit different again, because here we're looking at, you know, people of high care needs, our children and also our elderly groups. So these 4 groups are important to us. And when we're doing our site survey and gathering information from our customers, how is a facility being used? When we get into institutional, you need to be cautious and understand not only that I'm working with an institutional occupancy, but I'm working with which of these 4 groupings. You can see I've identified them oftentimes by how many people can be within that facility, you know, 16 or more people, 5 or more people, but also what is their level of care, incapable of self-preservation. That is where we really have to break down into the subgroupings. And with delayed egress, we're going to break into those groups. So later on, you're going to see this slide come up time and time again. So what I want to do is we're going to go back to the major occupancy group again, and we're going to talk a little bit about E and understanding E educational, because E educational, it can be kind of confusing because you have to have a better understanding of how an occupancy is being used. When we're working with E educational, you know, we talk about, you know, the separation between adult and child. Oftentimes that separation point is K-12. But when we're dealing with some of our smaller children, we need to have a better understanding of that educational versus institutional as well. So when we start looking at how a building is being used, we may go into a facility and we find children, but we need to break that children group into two different pockets and understand, am I working with an E-educational group or am I working with an I group for daycare center? The two breakdowns occur within Chapter 3, Section 305, Educational Group E. And to have an educational group E, we're looking at 1, the number of children who may be involved, 5 or more, and also more particular, their age in which the children are allowed to come within that facility. When we're working with an educational group daycare type of facility, we're dealing with children who are 2.5 years of age and older. I remember when my daughter was young and my wife was a high school teacher and I was working, we had to put our daughter into a program and we wanted to get her into a Montessori program. Well, she could only get into that Montessori program when she was 2.5 years of age. That's where they created that separation. So depending on what type of facility you're looking at for care, they have limitations based on age restrictions to maintain the separation between a group E and a group I. Because when you go into Chapter 3, Section 308, Institutional Group I, here we have to understand it's about the number of children and now the age of children. Now you're looking at children that are up to 100 in count, up to 100 children in count. And the age can not only be 2.5 years and older, but also younger, all the way to our infants. So they have a separation when it comes into thinking about child care. What type of facility are they in? E-educational group, 2.5 years of age and older, 5 and more children, or up to 100 children of all ages from infants to whatever age, and sometimes they oftentimes have preschool programs in some of these schools as well. So as we've talked about previously, occupancy is critical to understand. Understanding how a building is being used is important to us because we're going to see many different applications. Oftentimes you might find an application where a community center, during the daytime it might be used for little old ladies and little old men to come in and play cards, and at nighttime it's used for a dance hall. So we have different occupancies. When you go to a business building and think about business meetings that you have, conference rooms that you have, buildings that are split for multiple uses, especially when you're dealing with businesses where you might have a retail in the front and manufacturing in the back, or even a school. Think about the school. We talked about daycare in particular earlier. Now we're going to talk about elementary schools, and we have a change that happened with elementary schools, and not just elementary schools, but also middle schools and high schools, something that deals with e-educational when it comes to delayed egress, but different types of manufacturing. Is it a low-grade manufacturing? Is it something dealing with certain types of hazardous materials when it comes to manufacturing? But also many mixed-use buildings we're running into as well, because we're seeing that some of those old buildings that are being remodeled, and maybe on the bottom you've got all retail, and now you go up on the top you've got residential, which is included with it. You might find a combination of businesses. We've got businesses in the bottom, you got retail on the bottom, and then you put residential up on top of it. High hazard is going to be one of those key areas which are very critical to us just because of potential for damage or injuries or spread of a hazardous material which could happen from it. And of course, one of the big ones we are going to continue to talk about is institutional. Because it's so critical, because when we're talking about delayed egress, that is probably, like I said, the fastest growing area in which we're putting delayed egress today. Not just regular institutional, but also elderly care. But we're going to continue to see it grow in many other areas, especially when we get into entertainment type of areas, museums, art galleries, retail areas. We're going to continue to see the growth there. Understanding signage that we're putting on the door, hardware we're going to put on the door, the next sections we're going to be jumping into next. So we're going to see lots of different images I want to show you, from retail images into some entertainment type of applications as well. And yes, we can use them in entertainment as well. So we're going to break this down as we get into the hardware next, and then we're going to get into codes themselves.